late afternoon sun stained the stained-glass windows of St. Jude's with molten hues of crimson and gold, casting the nave into a shifting tapestry of colour. The church was quiet, save for the faint creak of wood as the verger, Mr. Phelps, moved down the aisle with his usual slow gait. He was an old man, proud of his custodianship of the house of God, and he performed his duties with the reverence of one who knew each stone and timber better than the lines of his own hand. It was therefore with more than routine irritation that he noticed the vestry door ajar. That door was never left open. Not at night, not at dusk, and certainly not when the bishop himself had made it quite clear. Bishop Carroway liked order, precision, and the semblance of sanctity unmarred by carelessness. Mr. Phelps pushed the door, its hinges whispering in protest, and peered inside. The vestry was not as he had left it earlier. The bishop's vestments were in disarray. A drawer in the carved oak chest stood half open, and on the carpet beneath the small writing desk lay something so startling that Phelps dropped his ring of keys with a clatter. Bishop Carroway himself lay sprawled on the rug, one hand extended as though to grasp at salvation, his lips frozen in a half-formed word. His face was pale, almost waxen in the wan light filtering through the window above. At first, Phelps thought the bishop had suffered some collapse, a heart attack perhaps. But then his eyes caught the detail that seemed at once trivial and profoundly wrong. A single playing card was resting on the bishop's chest, the Queen of Spades, stark against the dark fabric of his cassock. Phelps' knees went weak. He whispered a prayer, though it faltered halfway, and then stumbled back into the nave, his trembling hands already fumbling for someone, anyone, to fetch help. Within the hour, the quiet sanctity of St. Jude's was ruptured by the arrival of the constabulary. Inspector Mallory was a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense air, and he quickly established that the bishop was not merely stricken by natural causes. There were faint traces about his lips, a discoloration that spoke to anyone versed in such matters. Poison. A chalice on the desk nearby still bore the dregs of wine, and Mallory ordered it taken for examination. The Queen of Spades, however, was the true puzzle. There was no pack of cards in the vestry, nor was the bishop known to entertain such frivolities. Some whispered the card was symbolic, a deliberate signature of the killer, but no one could venture what the meaning might be. The vestry itself added another layer of impossibility. The windows were narrow, barred long ago to prevent intrusion. The door, as Phelps insisted and Mallory confirmed, had been locked from within until the verger himself opened it. No key was missing, and the lock bore no marks of tampering. Yet the bishop had not been alone in his final moments. That much was plain. Someone had reached him, slipped poison into his wine, and left behind the mocking token of the Queen of Spades, all without apparent means of exit. Miss Marple heard the news in her quiet way. She was staying with her niece, Mrs. Walters, whose cottage lay only a short walk from the churchyard. Word of the bishop's death travelled with unusual speed, carried on the wings of gossip and whispered speculation. Mrs. Walters, with a grave expression, mentioned it over tea, expecting her aunt to be shocked. Miss Marple, however, only set her cup down with careful precision, and remarked how curious it was that the Queen of Spades should appear in such a setting. By the time she strolled to the church the following morning, Mallory was already chafing under the puzzle. He stood in the vestry, studying the locked windows and the desk with an expression that mingled frustration and determination. He did not altogether welcome Miss Marple's presence. He rarely welcomed the interference of amateurs, but her reputation was such that he found himself explaining the bare facts all the same. "The poison, madam," he said, "was most likely slipped into the bishop's chalice not long before he drank it. But who could have done so? The sacristy was closed, no one was seen entering, and even his own chaplain swears he left the bishop not 10 minutes before." "And the card?" Miss Marple asked softly, her eyes lingering on the Queen of Spades, now sealed in a small evidence envelope. Mallory exhaled. "That's the devil of it. No one can tell me why it should be here, or what it means." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the precise alignment of books on the shelf, the faint smear of dust on the open drawer, the trace of wax where a candle had guttered longer than it ought. "It means something," she murmured, almost to herself. "Things like that always do, but whether it is meant to mislead, or whether it is meant to reveal, is another matter." The locked room element of the case gnawed at Mallory, but Miss Marple's thoughts were already elsewhere. She thought of Bishop Carroway, a man with an austere reputation, stern even in his piety, and she wondered who might harbour cause to see him dead. Bishops were not usually murdered without reason, and yet here he was, cold in the vestry, with the Queen of Spades upon his breast as though death itself had claimed him with a gambler's flourish. The crime was impossible, the clue nonsensical, but Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, knew impossibility, and nonsense often concealed the most human of motives. Miss Marple stood quietly in the vestry while Inspector Mallory dictated instructions to his constables. They were thorough men, searching the bishop's desk drawers, examining the narrow barred windows, and noting down statements from the church staff. Yet their movements, though brisk, lacked delicacy. Miss Marple had seen it many times before, the obvious facts collected in haste while the subtler truths went unnoticed. She did not interfere at once. She merely let her gaze wander, calm and unhurried, as though she were an elderly lady admiring the embroidery on the bishop's vestments. It was then that she noticed the bishop's writing desk. Papers lay stacked neatly, but one sheet had been placed at an odd angle, as if slipped in with less care than his usual precision. Bishop Carroway, she knew by reputation, was a man of impeccable order. To leave a paper skewed suggested haste, or perhaps an intruder's hand. She said nothing, only let her fingers linger over a hymnal nearby, her sharp eyes noting the faint indentation of handwriting on the top sheet. Inspector Mallory turned just in time to see her, and his brow furrowed. "Now then, Miss Marple, I must remind you not to disturb the evidence." "Oh, I assure you, Inspector," she replied mildly, "I have no wish to disturb anything at all, but isn't it interesting how certain people leave their mark without realizing it?" Mallory frowned, unsure what she meant, but she offered nothing further. He returned to his work, though a faint irritation lingered. When the witnesses were called into the adjoining room for statements, Miss Marple made her quiet way there as well. The verger, Phelps, sat hunched, his gnarled hands twisting his cap. He spoke in tremulous tones of finding the bishop, his voice cracking each time he recalled the sight. Near him sat Reverend Holt, the bishop's chaplain, younger than expected, his pale hair falling across his forehead as he tried to compose himself. Holt claimed he had left the bishop scarcely 10 minutes before the body was found, sent to fetch a ledger from the parish office. But Miss Marple noticed something others did not, the way his eyes flicked nervously each time the Queen of Spades was mentioned, as though the card pricked at some private memory. She filed it away silently. There was also Mrs. Branson, the bishop's housekeeper, a woman of formidable bulk and stern demeanour. She insisted she had been in the kitchens at the time preparing supper. She crossed herself vigorously as she spoke, but Miss Marple observed how the woman's hands trembled when Mallory asked if anyone bore the bishop ill will. "He was a hard man, sir," she muttered. "Hard, but fair." The words rang oddly hollow, as if rehearsed. Then came young Alice Harper, the organist's daughter, who had been practising in the loft above the nave that evening. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she spoke of hearing nothing unusual beyond her music. No footsteps, no voices, no cry for help. Yet Miss Marple caught the faintest hesitation when Mallory asked if she had seen anyone leave. "No," Alice said too quickly. "No one at all." The denial had been offered before the question was fully finished. By the time the questioning ended, Miss Marple had noted 3 small but telling peculiarities. A skewed paper on the desk, a chaplain, unsettled by the sight of a playing card, and a young girl too eager to insist she saw nothing. None of these, she knew, amounted to proof, but in her long experience, truth was like a dropped stitch, easily missed by hurried eyes, yet always leading to a flaw in the pattern. That evening, Mallory allowed Miss Marple to walk with him around the churchyard as the last light faded. He did not entirely approve of her presence, but something in her calm manner softened his resistance. "I tell you plainly, madam," he said, "this business has a queer smell to it. The bishop locked in from the inside, poisoned wine, and that blasted card. Too many contradictions." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, pausing to admire a rosebush along the path. "Contradictions are the soul of deception, Inspector. When things do not fit together, it is rarely the facts themselves that are at fault, but rather the story someone wishes us to believe." Mallory gave a grunt, neither agreement nor dismissal. He thought her quaint. Yet when she stooped and plucked a small scrap of paper lodged in the gravel near the vestry wall, he found himself waiting for her comment. She merely studied it in the dim light and tucked it into her glove. Later, in the quiet of Mrs. Walter's sitting room, Miss Marple examined her find, a torn corner of paper bearing the faint image of a spade from what must have been a playing card. But the colour was not black, it was red. The fragment belonged to a diamond or a heart, not a spade, which meant the Queen of Spades found on the bishop had not come from the same deck as the fragment outside. Someone had planted the card deliberately, carrying it separately from a mismatched set. The implication was subtle, but chilling. The killer had not merely left a token by chance. They had contrived it with intention, meaning the bishop's death was premeditated and staged. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, knitting in her lap. Her needles clicked softly, but her mind was sharp and restless. The bishop had many in his orbit, those who revered him, those who feared him, and perhaps those who hated him. Somewhere among them lay a motive strong enough to warrant murder cloaked in theatrics, and somewhere in their faltering words and restless hands lay the thread she needed to follow. She smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it, only recognition. In her long life she had seen greed masked by piety, envy hidden beneath loyalty, and malice dressed up as duty. Bishop Carroway's secret, she felt, would prove no different. The Queen of Spades was not the riddle, it was the signal, and already she sensed who had flinched at its sight. Inspector Mallory had assembled the key witnesses in the bishop's study at the rectory the following morning. The room smelled faintly of beeswax polish and old paper, its shelves lined with theological tomes that seemed to watch the proceedings with silent gravity. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the hearth, her knitting resting in her lap. She looked for all the world like a kindly old aunt, but her eyes missed nothing. The first to be questioned was Reverend Holt, the bishop's chaplain. He sat stiffly, clasping his hands together as though in prayer, though his knuckles whitened with the pressure. "I left the bishop," he explained, "not long before his death." He was going over the parish accounts, as was his habit in the evenings. He seemed quite himself, stern but in no distress. He bade me fetch a ledger from the office, which I did. When I returned, the vestry door was locked and, well, you know what followed. Mallory pressed him. "You say he was alone when you left him? No visitor? No sound of anyone entering?" "None at all," Holt answered quickly. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. His voice quavered as though rehearsed, and when Mallory mentioned the Queen of Spades, Holt's gaze fell to his clasped hands, his lips tightening. He made no comment on the card at all, merely shook his head as though baffled. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple softly to herself, though not so softly that Holt failed to hear. He glanced at her with a flicker of unease before Inspector Mallory dismissed him. Mrs. Branson, the housekeeper, came next, her sturdy shoes clacking on the polished floor. She folded her arms across her ample bosom and spoke in the blunt tones of a woman accustomed to managing others. The bishop was a strict man, she declared, but righteous. He had his enemies, to be sure, those who thought him too harsh in his judgments. But he lived as he preached, and I saw no reason to expect, well, this. "You were in the kitchens when it happened?" Mallory asked. "Aye, preparing his supper, boiled mutton and broth as he liked." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "And you heard nothing from the vestry? No sound of distress?" The housekeeper shook her head firmly. "No, ma'am. The bishop never called for help. He would have considered it weakness. Even if he had been ailing, he'd have gone in silence." It was a strange remark, and Miss Marple noted it. To speak of his pride in that moment suggested more familiarity with his private habits than one might expect of a servant, and the housekeeper's insistence on his righteousness carried the weight of a woman trying to convince not others, but herself. Alice Harper was summoned after, her young face pale beneath the weight of so many eyes. She twisted a lace handkerchief in her hands as she spoke. "I was in the loft, practising. My father had asked me to prepare for Sunday's hymn. I didn't hear anything unusual." "No voices?" Mallory asked. "No, sir, only my music." Miss Marple's eyes lingered kindly on the girl. "My dear, forgive me, but you must have stopped playing now and again. To turn a page, perhaps, or to rest your fingers." Alice blinked, flustered. "Yes, I suppose so." "And in those, Pauses, you truly heard nothing? The girl hesitated. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again. Finally, she whispered, "Well, perhaps I did hear footsteps, but I thought it must be the verger moving about below. I didn't want to say for fear of being mistaken." "Footsteps," Mallory repeated grimly. "And you didn't see who it was?" Alice shook her head. Her hands trembled. Miss Marple's gentle expression did not change, but she saw at once that the girl knew more than she dared say. Fear clouded her honesty, and fear was often the most revealing of motives. Lastly, old Phelps was brought in. His voice quavered as he repeated the tale of finding the bishop, his hands shaking so violently that Mallory had to ask him to sit. He swore he had locked the vestry door earlier that evening, as was his custom. "It was fast, sir, tight as could be," he insisted. "No one could have gone in or out without me knowing. And yet—" His voice broke, and he looked down at his lap. Miss Marple watched him closely. There was genuine distress in his manner, yet also guilt of another sort, a guilt that did not stem from murder, perhaps, but from negligence or a secret kept. She thought of the vestry door standing ajar, of the keys that had clattered from his hands. Phelps was hiding something, though whether it was relevant to the bishop's death remained uncertain. When the questioning was finished, the room hummed with unease. Each had told their tale, and yet none aligned. Holt claimed no one had been with the bishop, but Alice had heard footsteps. Mrs. Branson painted the bishop as stern but saintly, yet her own trembling hands suggested bitterness. Phelps insisted the vestry was locked, yet somehow the killer had entered and left without trace. Contradiction hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Mallory paced by the window, muttering that it was a nest of liars. Miss Marple, by contrast, sat serenely, her needles glinting in the lamplight. She had listened not only to words, but to silences, not only to what was spoken, but to what was withheld. Each voice had carried a note of deception, faint but undeniable. "The truth, Inspector," she said at last, "is like a quilt made of many scraps. One must look for the pieces that do not quite match. They are the ones that tell us where the fabric has been patched and why." Mallory gave her a sidelong glance. "So, which piece is the false one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, I think, will depend upon who feared the bishop's judgment most, for he was not a man without enemies. And those who speak too quickly or too smoothly are often the ones who would rather we did not ask further questions." Her eyes, calm and bright, settled for a moment on Reverend Holt, then on Mrs. Branson, then on the trembling Alice. Each bore the shadow of deception, though its source was yet concealed. The Queen of Spades still lay between them all, a silent accuser. The following day, Inspector Mallory spread the witness statements across the long oak table in the rectory library, his brow furrowed in stubborn concentration. He had already read them through twice, yet the contradictions refused to yield. Miss Marple sat opposite, her knitting clicking softly, her eyes half lowered as though the matter were no more pressing than the pattern of her wool. But inwardly, she was arranging each piece of testimony, each falter in tone, into a tapestry of human weakness. For in murder, as in life, it was seldom the facts alone that mattered, but the passions and fears that lay beneath them. Reverend Holt, the bishop's chaplain, was the first knot in the tangle. He had served Bishop Carroway faithfully for 3 years, but rumour suggested their relationship was not without strain. Holt was ambitious, eager to rise within the church, while Carroway was known for his severity in curbing what he saw as pride. More than once Holt's sermons had been corrected, his accounts scrutinised, his conduct measured against the bishop's unyielding standard. For a young man, proud and restless, such chastisement could sour into resentment, and his strange reaction to the Queen of Spades, his eyes darting away as though it stirred a memory, was not the reaction of a man merely shocked. Mrs. Branson, the housekeeper, presented a different picture, loyal, devoted, but also weary from years of service. Her hands had trembled as she spoke of the bishop's righteousness, yet Miss Marple had detected something brittle beneath her words. The bishop's austerity was felt most keenly in the household, where thrift was demanded and indulgence frowned upon. The housekeeper had once had a son dismissed from the choir for petty misbehaviour, and it was whispered she had never forgiven the bishop's cold judgment. Resentment and wounded pride could fester long in the heart of a servant who could never answer back. Alice Harper, the organist's daughter, was another matter altogether. She had no official tie to the bishop, only the church itself. Yet she had flinched when questioned, and her too hasty denial of seeing anyone suggested fear. Miss Marple recalled how youth, when frightened, often told partial truths. And when pressed, Alice had admitted to hearing footsteps. If she had seen more than she dared say, then silence was her protection. But protection from whom? From an elder she feared, or from the shadow of her own guilt? And then there was poor Phelps, the verger, his frailty, his trembling voice, his insistence that the vestry had been securely locked. All might be the nervousness of old age. Yet Miss Marple had seen guilt in his eyes, not of murder, but of something concealed. He had been custodian of the church for decades. He knew every lock and key, every bolt and hinge. If anyone understood how a door might appear locked when it was not, it would be him. Inspector Mallory laid down his pen with a sigh. Every one of them had cause. Enough, he muttered. Holt with his pride, the housekeeper with her bitterness, the girl with her lies, the verger with his secrets. But I'll be damned if I can see which cause matches the method. Poisoned wine, a locked vestry, a card laid across the body. It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are from different boxes. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. Human motives, Inspector, are rarely tidy things. One does not always find one single cause, like a neat thread leading to the truth. Often they are tangled skeins overlapping, each not pulling on another. Mallory gave her a weary look. And how does that help us? It helps, Miss Marple said gently, because one must look for the common thread. Who benefits, and in what way, from the bishop's death? Resentment may wound, fear may silence, but murder is seldom committed without a gain, be it freedom, advancement, or the covering of a sin. She let her mind drift over what she had observed. Holt would inherit not money, but influence. He might well be named the bishop's successor, should the vacancy arise. Mrs. Branson had no prospect of gain, save perhaps a petty vengeance for long-held slights. Alice Harper could gain nothing at all, unless her silence hid someone she loved. And Phelps, old and tired, might gain only peace from a burden long carried, though Miss Marple doubted he possessed the strength or will to orchestrate such a theatrical crime. It was Holt, she thought, who stood most to gain, yet his eagerness would also make him the easiest to suspect. Too obvious, perhaps, unless someone else had counted on that very obviousness. Mallory interrupted her thoughts by tapping the Queen of Spades, still sealed in its envelope. "This blasted thing," he growled. "If only I knew what it meant." Miss Marple looked at it with calm curiosity. "The Queen of Spades, Inspector, has long been associated with misfortune, sometimes betrayal. In certain circles it can mean a woman of malice, in others a token of ill luck. But here, in a church vestry, it is no natural presence, which suggests it was meant as a message or a mask." Mallory frowned. "Mask?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "A mask to make us look the wrong way. Someone placed it with care, but someone else left behind a scrap of another card altogether, which suggests more than one hand may have been involved." The inspector stared at her, and for once his bluster failed him. "You mean 2 people working together?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps. Or perhaps one trying to cover the tracks of another. It is not yet clear. But what is clear, Inspector, is that Bishop Carroway's death was no act of sudden impulse. It was arranged, considered, and carried out with intent, and intent always leaves traces, if one knows where to look." Mallory muttered under his breath, pacing again. "So, which of them is it? Holt, with his ambition, the housekeeper, with her grudges, the girl, with her secrets, or the verger, with his keys?" Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the neat stack of statements on the table. "Perhaps, Inspector, it is all of them, in their way, for every one of them has a reason, but only one had the opportunity. That is the thread we must untangle next." And as she bent once more to her knitting, she thought of Holt's uneasy glance at the Queen of Spades, of Mrs. Branson's trembling hands, of Alice's quick denials, of Phelps's quavering guilt. Each was a voice in the chorus of deception, each singing in a different key. Somewhere in their dissonance lay the harmony of truth waiting to be found. The maze of motives stretched before her, tangled and dark. But Miss Marple had walked such paths before, and she knew, in every maze there is always a centre. One simply has to follow the signs. Inspector Mallory was in rare good spirits the next morning. He strode into the rectory library with a confidence that contrasted sharply with the gloom of the previous day, waving a paper triumphantly. "We've got them, Miss Marple," he declared, dropping the sheet onto the table. "A letter, plain as day, hidden in Reverend Holt's desk at the parish office, and it speaks of debts, gambling debts if I'm not mistaken. That Queen of Spades wasn't just a random calling card, it was a warning. Holt poisoned the bishop to silence his disapproval, and the card was a signature from the men he owed." Miss Marple looked at the letter quietly. The ink was faded in places, as though handled often, and the writing was scrawled in a hand not quite Holt's. It mentioned sums owed, a meeting missed, and a warning that luck could not shield him forever. A careless man might have taken it at face value. Mallory had certainly done so. "It is a tidy explanation," Miss Marple said gently. "Almost too tidy." "Nonsense," Mallory replied briskly. "The bishop must have discovered Holt's vice. He was strict, intolerant of weakness. He would not have allowed his chaplain to gamble away his reputation, or the church's. Holt feared exposure, and so he killed him." Miss Marple's needles clicked, a calm counterpoint to his excitement. "And yet, Inspector, the vestry was locked from within. How did Holt accomplish that, if he had just slipped away to fetch a ledger? And why leave the Queen of Spades upon the bishop's chest, if it only pointed back to his own debts? Men who commit crimes seldom sign them so openly." Mallory brushed this aside with a wave of his hand. "Criminals are rarely cleverer than we think, madam. More often they stumble in their arrogance. Holt thought he was clever, but he wasn't." Still, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the letter. Something in it rang false. Gambling debts, yes, but the style of the writing was coarse, almost theatrical, as though the writer wanted the threat to be obvious. A man with true intent to collect would have been subtler. That afternoon, Holt was brought in under arrest. He paled when the letter was read aloud, his voice breaking as he denied ever owing such debts. Mallory thundered at him about his ambition, his desire to rise in the bishop's place, his fear of exposure. Holt's protests only made him look the more desperate. Mrs. Branson muttered darkly that she had always suspected the young chaplain was too smooth by half. Phelps shook his head, muttering that ambition was a dangerous sin, and Alice Harper looked at Holt with wide eyes that seemed less shocked than frightened, as though her fear was not of him, but of what his arrest might conceal. Mallory pressed his advantage. "We'll have the chemists test the chalice for fingerprints. If Holt handled it, we'll know soon enough, and the matter of the Queen of Spades will be clear." That evening, the village buzzed with talk of the bishop's chaplain exposed at last. Holt's reputation, once untarnished, now seemed blackened beyond repair. Yet Miss Marple, in her quiet way, felt no satisfaction. She sat in her niece's sitting room, her knitting resting in her lap, her mind tracing every step of the crime. The vestry door, locked from within, the card planted with deliberate care, the fragment of another card found outside, and Holt, pale and stammering, perhaps guilty of foolishness, but not, she felt, of murder. The Queen of Spades was too theatrical a clue for a man like Holt. It smacked of cunning, not desperation. And Miss Marple had seen the faces of those gathered when Holt was accused. Mrs. Branson's relief had been too great, her hands unclasping as though a burden had lifted. Phelps had crossed himself fervently, but behind his sorrow lurked something that looked like shame. And Alice Harper, Alice had looked not relieved but stricken, as though the wrong man's capture sealed her silence even tighter. Mallory, in his triumph, did not see it, but Miss Marple, who had spent her life watching the smallest betrayals of expression in drawing-rooms and village lanes, saw it all too clearly. Holt might have had a motive. He might even have had debts, but his clumsy denials had the ring of truth, while others' relief smelt too much of guilt. When the inspector left that night, certain of his victory. Miss Marple remained awake by the fire. She thought of Bishop Carroway, stern, unbending, a man who ruled by fear as much as by faith. Such men gather shadows around them, shadows of those they rebuke, those they disappoint, those they shame. Each shadow might long for freedom, but only one had found the courage or the desperation to act. The false victory tasted bitter in her mouth, for Miss Marple knew what Mallory did not. The real criminal had not yet been touched. They were still there, close by, cloaked in the satisfaction of having thrown suspicion onto another, waiting, perhaps, for one final move. And as the church bell tolled midnight across the village, she wondered, would they strike again now that they believed themselves safe? Miss Marple awoke before dawn the following morning, restless and unable to settle her mind. She rose quietly, dressing in her habitual calm, and walked to the rectory window. The church spire loomed against the misty morning sky, and the village, still half asleep, seemed wrapped in a shroud of expectation. Her thoughts lingered on Holt's arrest, the Queen of Spades, and the fragment of the red card she had found. Something about the entire sequence of events seemed rehearsed, as if a careful hand had nudged suspicion where it would be most easily caught. But by whom? And why? She began her morning with a careful review of the older parish records, letters, and accounts stored in the rectory library. There, among yellowed sheets of paper and the fading ink of forgotten parishioners, she found a notation she had overlooked before, a brief mention of a small dispute some 15 years prior. The entry concerned a local youth, then employed in minor church duties, who had been dismissed following accusations of minor theft and deceit. The name caught her attention. Phelps, the very verger who now trembled so visibly whenever the bishop's death was mentioned. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. It was not unusual for a past grievance to linger quietly for years, particularly in a person accustomed to discretion and patience. Phelps had always been an outwardly loyal man, but buried resentment might explain his odd behaviour during questioning, the subtle shame Miss Marple had noticed when Holt was blamed. He was old, yes, but a long-buried grievance combined with a moment of opportunity could drive even the most unobtrusive of men to desperate measures. Yet there was more. Among the older records she found a series of letters from a former organist, Alice Harper's father, addressed to Bishop Carroway. The letters, though seemingly mundane in their discussions of music and parish arrangements, hinted at a tense relationship. The elder Harper had requested the bishop's approval for his daughter to perform, and Carroway had denied it repeatedly, citing her youth and inexperience. Though these rejections were not severe in themselves, they hinted at the bishop's rigid hand in guiding and controlling those around him. Miss Marple reflected that resentment might travel like a quiet stream beneath the surface of daily life, shaping actions subtly before erupting into dramatic consequence. As she pieced these threads together, a pattern began to emerge. Holt's ambition, Mrs. Branson's bitterness, Alice Harper's restrained fear, and Phelps's long-ago grievance were not isolated. They intersected through the bishop's iron-fisted oversight. He had ruled not only his household but the parish itself, leaving marks on the lives of each person who had served him, either by direct chastisement or the subtle pressures of expectation. Each had a reason to fear or resent him. Miss Marple decided to revisit the scene, walking once more to St. Jude's, taking in the calm of the empty nave before the morning service. She observed the vestry closely, noting the placement of the desks, the locks, and the narrow windows. Her eyes fell upon the oak chest where the bishop's vestments were kept. One hinge creaked faintly under her gentle push, revealing a floor long overlooked. A hidden compartment, subtle but just large enough to conceal small papers, or perhaps a piece of card. Her heart quickened slightly. It was a clue that had been invisible to the casual observer, yet spoke to her growing sense that the crime had been orchestrated with intimate knowledge of the room's minutiae. Returning to the rectory, she invited Alice Harper to join her in the garden under the pretext of a walk. The girl's expression was hesitant, a mixture of fear and relief, and Miss Marple spoke gently, guiding her toward honesty. Slowly, Alice revealed that she had seen Phelps in the vestry shortly before the bishop's death, carrying something small in his hand. Though she had been too frightened to speak, she had assumed it was merely a parish ledger or a piece of parchment, but the trembling verger, combined with her own fear, had kept her silent. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Phelps had access, opportunity, and motive. Long-standing resentment coupled with the right moment to act. The red card fragment she had found outside could be explained as an accident during his movement, leaving a false trail for anyone who looked too closely at Holt. And the Queen of Spades, carefully planted atop the bishop's chest, was meant to mislead and dramatize, lending an air of premeditated sophistication to the crime. Yet she could not ignore Holt entirely. There was a human tendency to stumble, to become a convenient scapegoat. Holt's ambition and his occasional lapses into recklessness had made him an easy target. Phelps had known precisely how to steer suspicion toward him, leaving just enough misleading evidence to satisfy the inspector's urge for a tidy resolution. And, crucially, Miss Marple realized, Phelps had studied the habits of everyone around him for years. The bishop's strict patterns, Holt's eager ambition, Alice's timidity, even Mrs. Branson's small resentments. This was not a crime of impulse. It was the calculated act of someone who knew the village, its people, and their weaknesses intimately. By late afternoon, she felt certain of the connections forming. Holt's ambition had made him appear guilty. Mrs. Branson's bitterness had flinched at accusation. Alice's fear had concealed a key observation. And Phelps, the quiet, loyal-seeming verger, had manipulated all of them, both in the present and through the echo of a grievance long buried. Shadows from the past had guided the present crime, and Miss Marple understood that uncovering the truth required a confrontation with those shadows. The village remained unaware of the web she had begun to unravel. To everyone else, Holt was still the accused, his guilt assumed, the case closed. But Miss Marple, calm and precise, knew that the real criminal lingered in the wings, cloaked by time, patience, and familiarity. And she also knew that when he finally moved again, the consequences would be swift and irrevocable. As she returned home that evening, knitting resumed quietly in her lap, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied thought. The past, no matter how deeply buried, always left its marks. One needed only the patience to see them. Miss Marple had spent the morning in quiet reflection, reviewing her notes, the fragment of red card, and the letter that had so neatly trapped Holt in Mallory's net. She knew that brute force and confrontation would achieve little. The real culprit thrived on expectation, confident in the authorities' rush to judgment. To uncover the truth, she needed something unconventional, something subtle that would coax a reaction too revealing to be faked. Her plan took shape as she prepared to return to the rectory, ostensibly to discuss Holt's defence with Inspector Mallory. In reality, she carried with her a small, carefully arranged set of objects, a full deck of playing cards neatly shuffled and stacked, along with a note she had written herself, unsigned, hinting at a secret observation she claimed to have made. The idea was simple: appeal to pride, fear, and curiosity simultaneously, and see whose composure fractured under the gentle weight of suggestion. Mallory was initially perplexed by her method, but the old lady's calm certainty persuaded him to let her try. "I do not see how a trick of cards will uncover the murderer," he grumbled, but he followed her into the library. Miss Marple arranged the cards across the table, leaving the Queen of Spades prominently displayed. She then addressed the assembled suspects, all summoned under the pretence of clarifying their statements. "I have been thinking," she said softly, "of the Queen of Spades, and of a curious fragment that was found outside the vestry. You may imagine that these details have no meaning, but in truth they are clues to a careful observer, and careful observation often reveals more than words can." The suspects shifted uneasily. Reverend Holt lowered his gaze, as if expecting the final accusation to land upon him. Mrs. Branson folded her hands tightly, her face slightly flushed. Alice Harper's eyes darted toward the cards, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. And old Phelps, the verger, who had seemed subdued these past days, now sat unusually still, his eyes flicking repeatedly between Miss Marple and the Queen of Spades. Miss Marple continued, deliberately casual. "I have been experimenting with a little test," she said, glancing at the deck. "Sometimes the smallest gesture, a glance, a shift of hands, a momentary hesitation, can reveal what the mind seeks to hide, and it need not be forceful. The mere suggestion is often enough." She laid the deck before Phelps and invited him, with a smile, to shuffle it. "It is quite simple," she said. "Just a shuffle, nothing more, but I should warn you, the Queen of Spades is always watching, even when you think it is hidden. The game is in your hands, and so is your truth." Phelps paled. His hands trembled slightly, yet he forced himself to touch the cards, fingers brushing the edges. Miss Marple's gaze remained soft but unyielding, allowing him only a fleeting moment to make a choice: act naturally or betray the hidden weight of conscience. Almost imperceptibly a flicker crossed his face, a tightening around the eyes, the subtle clenching of lips, a shift in posture that he could not fully control. Miss Marple observed it with the precision of a clockmaker. The small slip told her what words had not. He knew the room, the vestry, the locks, and the secret of the Queen of Spades. The deliberate planting, the fragment of the red card, the careful misdirection, all of it bore his hand, or at least his orchestration. Alice Harper, watching him, stiffened. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had not meant to frighten the girl, but her nerves were quick to react, and the sudden change in Phelps confirmed what the girl had already hinted during their walk in the garden. She had seen him move something small in the vestry. Mrs. Branson muttered, almost to herself, "He always did know too much, even when we thought him harmless." The remark went unnoticed by Mallory, but Miss Marple filed it neatly. It reinforced the notion that Phelps's knowledge had been accumulated over decades, giving him the opportunity to manipulate appearances and stage events in a way that would mislead the authorities. Holt remained silent, yet his relief was evident. The letter had ensnared him, but only superficially. Miss Marple now understood that Phelps had relied on Holt's ambition to act as a convenient scapegoat, allowing the real story to remain hidden. Holt's role had been circumstantial, his apparent guilt a clever diversion. Miss Marple allowed the deck to remain on the table and spoke once more, her voice steady. "You see, Inspector, sometimes the simplest tool, a suggestion, a glance, or the presence of an object, can do what hours of questioning cannot. For guilt, when practiced over years and exercised with care, can often be shielded. But a small nudge, a gentle test, is enough to reveal the faintest fracture in the mask." Phelps's hands shook more visibly now, and the colour drained from his face. He avoided all eye contact, fingers brushing nervously against the table edge. It was enough. Miss Marple's unconventional tactic had worked. The subtle pressure, combined with the symbolism of the card, had caused the man to betray the weight he had carried. Inspector Mallory, who had watched the scene with a mixture of irritation and awe, finally leaned forward. "Do you mean to say—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "that the man who appears least threatening is often the one who has mastered patience and observation, and it is precisely because he appears harmless that suspicion is diverted elsewhere." She allowed the silence to settle over the room, letting the implications sink into every mind present. Holt, Mrs. Branson, Alice, they were all actors in a carefully orchestrated tableau, but Phelps, the verger, had been the quiet hand arranging the stage, using the ambitions, fears, and resentments of others to mask his own intent. And in that small, unremarkable gesture, the shuffle of a deck, the flicker of a gaze, the tremor of a hand, Miss Marple had found the unmistakable signature of the true criminal. Miss Marple was reviewing her notes in the quiet of her sitting-room when a sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A young constable, breathless from haste, handed her a telegram marked urgent. She unfolded it carefully. The message was brief. The envelope containing the Queen of Spades and the fragment of red card, the very objects she had intended to show Inspector Mallory as part of her careful plan, had vanished from the evidence drawer at the police station. A chill ran down her spine. Someone had removed the items deliberately. It was no accident. The crime scene, the locked vestry, and the planted card had already suggested a mind capable of foresight and calculation. Now that mind had reached beyond the immediate crime, reaching into the workings of justice itself. She rose calmly, though her mind worked at speed. Whoever had taken the evidence must be watching the investigation closely. They understood that these small items could reveal the true hand behind the bishop's death. The perpetrator had the cunning not merely to commit murder, but to manipulate the course of discovery, guiding suspicion away from themselves. Miss Marple knew she needed to act, but carefully. Panic or overt interference would only alert the culprit. She dressed and walked the streets toward the rectory, keeping her pace unhurried and her demeanour ordinary. Yet her mind was alert to every detail, the passing glances of villagers, the faint sound of hurried footsteps in a quiet lane, the low murmur of voices that did not belong in the dawn stillness. When she arrived at the rectory, Inspector Mallory was in a rare state of agitation, pacing by the hearth. "They're gone!" he exclaimed. "The evidence! How could this happen?" Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea with calm precision. "Inspector, it is not the how that concerns me, but the who. Whoever took the items knows more than we do, and they are still close at hand, no doubt observing each movement we make." Mallory ran a hand over his face. "Then the case is ruined. The evidence we counted on, the very proof linking Holt, the card, and the vestry, has vanished. We're back to square one." "Perhaps not entirely," Miss Marple said softly, her mind already forming a plan. "It is often said that when one door closes, another reveals itself. We must look for traces of the removal. Even the most careful hand leaves a mark, however slight." She returned to the police station with Mallory reluctantly in tow. Together they examined the drawers, the shelves, and the nearby floor. At first there appeared to be nothing amiss, but Miss Marple's keen eye caught a faint smudge on the edge of the desk drawer, a slight discoloration in the polish where a hand had rested too long. The print was incomplete, blurred, and almost imperceptible, but it suggested someone had handled the envelope carefully but hastily, leaving only a trace for the observant. "See here," she said softly. "This handprint is too small to belong to the constables who normally handle evidence. And notice the direction. It points toward the door, not back toward the desk. Whoever took the items moved them deliberately and quickly, leaving no other trace." Mallory leaned closer. "But who? Who among the suspects could have done this?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady, focused. It must be someone confident, someone who has already shown initiative and a keen understanding of the investigation, the kind of person who knows precisely how evidence is handled and knows the consequences of what they touch. Think of those we have observed carefully. Who has patience, knowledge, and the audacity to act without immediate detection. Mallory frowned. "You mean someone like Phelps?" Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Precisely. Consider his familiarity with the church, the vestry, and the habits of those around him. He has shown an unusual degree of patience and foresight. And, as we discovered earlier, he is capable of subtle manipulation. Removing the items now would be consistent with someone seeking to cover their tracks before the full truth emerges." The thought sent a shiver through Mallory. If he's so careful, he might anticipate our every move. How do we catch him? Miss Marple set her teacup down with a soft clink. "Not by chasing shadows blindly, Inspector. By laying a trap he cannot resist. The trick is to offer a glimpse of the evidence, or something resembling it, and observe the reaction. Even the most controlled criminal has a tell, a momentary lapse in composure. That is when we learn the truth." She paused, her mind assembling the pieces like a jigsaw puzzle. Holt had been convenient, but innocent of the murder itself. The others had motives, yet none had the opportunity or the cunning to orchestrate the crime. Phelps had knowledge, access, and patience, and now the vanishing of the evidence had confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along. He was actively manipulating the investigation. In the rectory garden, the late morning sun cast long shadows, but Miss Marple's own thoughts were sharper than any blade. She considered the Queen of Spades and the red card fragment, the locked vestry, and the long-buried grievances. Each element was a thread, and Phelps had been quietly cutting and retying them to mislead the authorities. The stolen evidence was merely another twist in his careful choreography, yet it also revealed the extent of his desperation. He knew the walls were closing in. As they returned to the rectory, Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. "A criminal who interferes with evidence fears exposure more than punishment. It is that fear, Inspector, that gives us leverage, and once we observe the crack in their composure, we will see the path forward." Mallory, still flustered, attempted to mask his doubt. "You really think he'll show himself?" Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "He already has. In the slightest tremor of his hand, in the quickening of his pulse, one need only know how to watch. And so the investigation entered a new, more dangerous phase. The vanishing of the Queen of Spades and the red card fragment had not stopped the truth. It had revealed it in miniature. Phelps was no longer merely a suspect. He was an active player, a shadow moving behind the scenes, and the detective's task had become far more delicate. Each step now required patience, observation, and a cunning of her own to counteract his. Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, assembling the plan she would use to draw him out, knowing that any mistake could allow the real criminal to slip once more into darkness. The game had changed, the stakes were higher, and in the quiet of the rectory she prepared herself for the subtle battle of observation and wit that was to come. Miss Marple was reviewing her carefully laid plans when the telegram arrived. She read it twice, her eyes narrowing, the tea in her hand cooling beside her. Reverend Holt had been released from custody after the chemical analysis confirmed no trace of poison in the bishop's chalice. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for Miss Marple, relief was an indulgence she could not afford. Before she could formulate her next move, a second, more urgent dispatch arrived. Old Mrs. Branson had been found unconscious in the servants' quarters, apparently struck from behind. The message was terse. She was alive, but shaken, and the local constable suspected foul play. Miss Marple felt a familiar chill. The criminal had shifted from manipulation to overt action. Someone was determined not to be exposed. She moved immediately, descending to the rectory streets with brisk, quiet steps. Inspector Mallory, who had just learned of Branson's assault, met her at the door, pale and unsettled. "This is no longer just about solving a locked-room murder, Miss Marple," he said, voice tight. "This is a maniac, a dangerous man, and he knows we are closing in." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Indeed, but one who strikes so early often leaves traces he believes are insignificant, and it is precisely those small traces we must watch for. At the scene, the servants' quarters were in disarray, though nothing appeared stolen. Mrs. Branson, pale and trembling, recounted her experience. "I heard nothing at first," she whispered, "and then a shadow fell across me. A hand struck my head. I cannot be certain of the face, but I remember the smell of old tobacco and the sound of a slow, deliberate step retreating down the hall." Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the details. Old tobacco, slow, deliberate steps. She compared the image in her mind to her prior observations. Only one person had exhibited a careful patience combined with habitual knowledge of the house's hidden corners. Phelps, the verger. Every other suspect had motive but lacked the combination of cunning and access. Mallory, however, insisted on following protocol, ordering a search of the village for any intruders or known criminals. Miss Marple allowed him his diligence, but she focused on subtler signs, the slight scuff on the floorboards near Branson's doorway, the faint fleck of soot on the windowsill where a shadow had passed, and most tellingly a tiny scrap of red paper, almost overlooked, lodged in the hem of Branson's skirt. The same red card fragment she had previously seen near the bishop's body. The implication was immediate and undeniable. The same hand that had manipulated the earlier crime was still active. Phelps was no longer content with clever misdirection. He was escalating, forcing the investigation to acknowledge his reach and capability. Miss Marple returned to the rectory with Branson in tow, carefully noting who lingered outside, whose eyes shifted when her gaze fell upon them. Alice Harper approached, ostensibly to inquire about the assaulted housekeeper, but she appeared unusually tense, her hands twisting in anxiety. Miss Marple's eyes met hers, calm yet probing. The girl flinched, a reaction small but revealing. The web was growing tighter, but so too were the risks. Whoever had struck Branson would strike again if provoked or cornered. Miss Marple realized she could not rely solely on observation. She needed to anticipate the criminal's moves, to predict where he would feel confident enough to act next, and to be ready before he could. That evening, she reviewed the sequence of events in her mind. The bishop's locked vestry, the planted Queen of Spades, Holt's misdirection, the vanishing evidence, and now the assault on Branson. Each step revealed a mind several moves ahead, orchestrating fear to delay discovery. The sophistication and patience required were rare, yet Phelps's long familiarity with the rectory, Its habits and its residents provided the perfect training ground. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Holt, who had been so conveniently ensnared by the letter and the stage debts. The former, Chaplin, had been a useful pawn, but the real strategist had not been exposed. Whoever orchestrated both crimes was confident, calculating, and daring, and if left unchecked, the next act could be lethal. She spoke quietly to herself, her voice almost a whisper, more for emphasis than for anyone else's ear. Patience, observation, subtle provocation. The criminal underestimates these tools, believing that fear alone can shield him. But one small misstep, one revealed sign, and his plan will unravel. Miss Marple began sketching a strategy. She would allow the investigation to continue in the public eye, so Mallory could maintain appearances of progress, while she herself would conduct a careful, quiet surveillance of those she now suspected most keenly. She would use distraction, suggestion, and subtle observation to provoke a revealing action. The attack on Mrs. Branson had confirmed a chilling truth. Phelps, or the mind behind the orchestrations, was still several steps ahead, watching every movement, anticipating every question. The stakes had shifted from solving the crime to preventing another tragedy. Miss Marple understood that she must act not only with cleverness, but with caution, lest the next victim be someone she could not save. As night fell, the rectory grew quiet, though the village itself was restless with gossip and speculation. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting needles idly clicking, her mind sharp, attuned to the faintest of irregularities. Every creak of a door, every shifting shadow, every hastened step might reveal the criminal's next move. The case had turned from mystery to immediate danger, and she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Outside, the church spire cast a long shadow across the village lanes, and Miss Marple, calm and watchful, knew that the next act was imminent. The criminal remained in the shadows, daring and patient, but she would not be caught unaware. This was no longer a simple investigation. It was a duel of wits, one that could save lives or allow the murderer to vanish entirely into darkness. Miss Marple sat quietly in the rectory garden, watching the sun cast long shadows across the hedges and flower beds. The village, still unsettled by the recent assault on Mrs. Branson, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next turn of events. She sipped her tea slowly, her knitting resting in her lap, but her mind was anything but idle. Amid the layers of deception, false leads, and misdirection, she felt the faintest glimmer of clarity, the sense that the threads, scattered though they seemed, were beginning to weave themselves into a coherent pattern. It was a detail so small that, on any other day, she might have overlooked it. A faint smudge on the corner of the rectory ledger, a seemingly trivial notation made by Phelps during his careful record-keeping, almost invisible unless one looked closely. Miss Marple recalled the exact way he had placed the ledger, back on the shelf during her first visit, almost deliberately angled, as if to make certain any observation of it would appear accidental. She remembered the flutter of his hands when Holt's letter had been discovered, the almost imperceptible twitch of his lips whenever the Queen of Spades was mentioned, the careful steps he took around the evidence, always leaving just enough to suggest he was innocent. Slowly, a pattern emerged in her mind. Phelps's actions were not random, nor were they purely reactive. Each misdirection, each carefully planted clue, each subtle act of manipulation served a single purpose: to guide suspicion toward others, while keeping himself safely in the background. The Queen of Spades, the fragment of red card, the letter implying Holt's debts, they were not evidence of Holt's guilt, but carefully staged signals meant to frame him. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Branson's attack. The assailant had moved with knowledge of the house, knowing where to strike without drawing immediate attention. The faint traces left behind, the scuff on the floor, the fleck of soot on the windowsill, the tiny fragment of red card, were consistent with someone who had lived among these walls for decades, someone who understood the habits and fears of every resident. Her eyes drifted to Alice Harper, seated on a nearby bench, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. The girl had seen Phelps moving something in the vestry, but fear had kept her silent. Miss Marple realized that Alice's hesitation, her careful avoidance of incriminating words, had been the final piece she needed. The girl had been a witness to a subtle action that, when combined with all other clues, exposed the orchestrator behind the crime. And then there was Holt, who had seemed so obviously guilty, ensnared by the staged letter. His ambition had made him a perfect scapegoat, yet the careful observer would notice the flaws, the awkward phrasing of the letter, the theatrical emphasis of the Queen of Spades, the mismatch between his knowledge and the placement of the evidence. Holt had the motive, but not the cunning. He could not have executed the crime with the precision and foresight displayed. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Phelps, who was quietly dusting the pews under the watchful eyes of the remaining parish staff. There it was, the final element, the unusual habit she had observed repeatedly over the past days. His meticulous attention to objects, placing them just so, straightening corners, arranging papers with deliberate care, was not mere fussy behaviour. It was a signature of his method, the way he controlled his environment to conceal his intentions. The pattern had been there all along, in the small gestures, the seemingly innocuous habits, the careful manipulation of appearances. Even the timing of events previously assumed random now fit into place. Holt had been accused at the exact moment Phelps anticipated the investigators would be most eager for closure. The letter, the apparent debts, the false sense of a solved case, they were all part of a larger rhythm, designed to delay discovery while testing the detective's responses. Each action, subtle or overt, was a step in a pattern only visible to someone who watched carefully, patiently, and without assumption. Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest smile. The chaos, the misdirection, the frenzied assumptions, all of it had been noise, a clever attempt to obscure a simple truth. The criminal's mind worked methodically, predictably, and always with an eye on the reactions of others. The pattern, hidden in plain sight, revealed the steps he had taken and hinted at what he might attempt next. She rose from the bench and walked slowly along the path, her eyes scanning the rectory grounds. Each small detail now had meaning. The angle of a ledger, a faint smudge on the hearth, the placement of a chair, even the way footsteps seemed to hesitate near certain corners. The pattern was complete. The deliberate misdirection, the careful staging, and the subtle control of the environment pointed unerringly toward Phelps. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to consider the implications. Understanding the pattern was not merely a matter of observation, it was a matter of anticipation. Now that she recognized the rhythm of his actions, she could predict his next move. The criminal had believed himself several steps ahead, but the pattern revealed that his steps were no longer hidden. Each movement, each calculated act, could be countered by foresight. Returning to the rectory, she found Inspector Mallory pacing, still uncertain of the next step. "Have you found something, Miss Marple?" he asked, hope and fatigue mingling in his voice. "Yes," she said quietly. "The pattern was always in front of us." Small details, ordinary habits, subtle manipulations, they all point to one hand guiding the entire course of events. The criminal's confidence, the false leads, the vanished evidence, it is all part of a design that is visible now, if one knows how to look. Mallory leaned closer. "You mean, we know who did it?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm yet sharp as a blade. "Yes, and knowing the pattern, we can predict his next move. The time for observation and patience is over. Now we act, or another victim may fall." In the quiet of the rectory, as the afternoon sun deepened the shadows across the floorboards, Miss Marple realized that the key to the entire case had been in plain sight all along. The villain's cleverness had relied on distraction, fear, and superficial appearances, but the pattern, once recognized, left no place to hide. And for the first time since the bishop's death, she allowed herself a moment of calm satisfaction. The truth was visible, the next steps clear, and the threads of deception ready to be unravelled. Miss Marple had spent the morning retracing her steps through the rectory, piecing together every observation, every subtle shift in behaviour, and every seemingly minor act that had now coalesced into a discernible pattern. She understood Phelps's movements, his careful manipulation of objects, and his calculated placement of evidence, but she still needed to grasp the deeper motivation behind the crime. The why, not merely the how, would reveal the full truth. She gathered the key witnesses in the rectory parlour, under the pretense of reviewing the case for clarity. Holt, still shaken but freed from suspicion, sat quietly in a corner. Alice Harper and Mrs. Branson occupied adjacent seats, both attentive yet uneasy. Inspector Mallory lingered near the hearth, his eyes betraying both fatigue and frustration. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a measured rhythm that belied the tension in the room. "Before we conclude," she began, her voice gentle, almost conversational, "there is one aspect we have yet to consider fully. The crime itself, the method, the misdirection, the careful framing of others, speaks not only to skill but to a deeply personal reason, one that has festered over many years." She allowed her gaze to settle on Phelps, who now stood awkwardly by the window, pretending to adjust the blinds. "It is easy to assume," she continued, "that crimes like these are motivated by ambition, money, or simple revenge. Yet when we examine the sequence of actions, the care with which the evidence was handled, the selection of the Queen of Spades, the manipulation of Holt, even the recent attack on Mrs. Branson, we see something far more personal, a need to assert control, to rewrite a narrative that had long humiliated or constrained him." Alice Harper's eyes widened slightly, her hands tightening around the edges of her skirt. Holt leaned forward, frowning, sensing the unfolding revelation. Even Mallory, who had been certain of Holt's guilt, paused, sensing that Miss Marple was about to expose something entirely unexpected. Miss Marple continued softly. "Phelps has lived in this rectory for decades, witnessing the bishop's judgment, Holt's ambition, and the vulnerabilities of those around him. He has absorbed the small injustices, the subtle manipulations, the quiet humiliations that the bishop and others inflicted, humiliations most of us might never notice. Over time, these accumulated slights fermented into a need for correction, a desire to take control where previously he had none." The verger's face twitched. His lips pressed tightly together, and he avoided eye contact. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unflinching, caught the slightest micro-expression, a combination of pride and fear. "This crime," she went on, "was never about money nor simple revenge. It was about reclaiming agency, exerting authority, and demonstrating to the world that he, once overlooked, underestimated, and constrained, could orchestrate events perfectly. Each misdirection, each planted clue, each manipulation of others' perceptions was a message that he had power over outcomes, over appearances, over justice itself." Holt finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "You mean it wasn't me?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "You were a convenient figure to frame because your ambition made you predictable. Phelps counted on that predictability. But the motive, deep and personal, lies in years of quiet observation, years of absorbed slights, and the desire to prove a point that no one had noticed until now." Mrs. Branson, still pale from her recent assault, shook her head slowly. "I had no idea. I thought it was just anger or debt or something ordinary. I never imagined it was so psychological." Miss Marple's knitting paused for a moment as she let her words sink in. "That is why his actions have been so precise, so patient, so carefully staged. He was not merely committing a crime, he was authoring a narrative, one that allowed him to control the story, manipulate perception, and orchestrate fear without exposing himself. His satisfaction did not lie in wealth or revenge, it lay in proving that he could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast everyone around him while remaining invisible." Phelps's hands had begun to shake slightly, and his composure faltered. He attempted to speak but hesitated, a low, almost inaudible murmur escaping him before he fell silent again. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And that, Phelps," she said softly but firmly, "is the truth that no amount of deception could conceal. It is not merely what you did, but why you did it, that makes your actions understandable." The verger finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time fully. There was no defiance in his gaze, only the faintest trace of resignation, and the acknowledgement that his careful web of manipulation had been seen and understood. "Do you understand now, Inspector?" Miss Marple said, turning to Mallory. The motive was never superficial. It was deeply personal, psychological, and subtle. Only by examining years of behaviour, the patterns of small acts and the carefully staged manipulations, could one uncover why a crime of such cunning was committed. Phelps' genius lay in patience, but his psychology, the hidden motive, is what drove him to extremes. Mallory nodded slowly, comprehension dawning, his earlier certainty about Holt replaced with reluctant awe at the depth of the verger's planning. Holt, relieved and vindicated, exhaled, and Alice Harper allowed herself a quiet, shaken smile, finally able to place the fear she had felt into context. Miss Marple leaned back, the soft click of her needles resuming the rhythm of thought. "Understanding the motive," she said softly, "is the key to resolving the rest. And now that we see it clearly, there is no longer any need for misdirection or for fear. The truth, once revealed, is unassailable." And in that quiet moment, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the rectory, the hidden motive lay bare, a mixture of pride, years of suppressed observation, and a profound desire to reclaim control, proving that crime is not always a matter of what one seeks, but why one cannot endure being powerless any longer. Miss Marple had spent the morning with a quiet intensity, arranging the rectory as though it were a stage set for the final act. Every chair, every object, every small detail had been placed with a purpose, to draw out the criminal by exploiting the pattern she had discerned. She had already pieced together Phelps' psychology, his hidden motives, and the meticulous methods he used to manipulate the investigation. Now it was a matter of timing, patience, and observation. She instructed Inspector Mallory to assemble the key witnesses in the parlour, ostensibly to review the ongoing investigation and provide clarity. Holt, Mrs. Branson, and Alice Harper were seated, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The windows were open just enough to let in the light of the late afternoon, illuminating the room and subtly highlighting the objects Miss Marple had intentionally positioned. The ledger angled precisely as Phelps had been seen adjusting it, a small scrap of the Queen of Spades placed on a side table, and the original envelope, carefully retrieved from its hiding place, resting in plain sight. Miss Marple spoke softly, drawing attention to these objects without seeming to accuse anyone. "You see, Inspector, evidence is not only what is found, but how it is observed. Some people believe they can manipulate appearances indefinitely, but all patterns, no matter how cleverly concealed, leave traces, and it is those traces that reveal the truth." Phelps, standing quietly near the hearth, shifted slightly, his eyes flicking to the ledger, then to the envelope, then back to Miss Marple. She noticed the subtle tremor in his fingers, the slight tightening of his jaw, small cracks in a mask he had worn for decades. "Reverend Holt, Alice, Mrs. Branson," she continued, her voice calm and measured, "I have been considering the sequence of events, the misdirections, the disappearance of evidence, and even the recent attack. It all points to one principle: the careful orchestration of perception. The individual responsible has relied on our assumptions, our expectations, and our oversight, and yet the pattern has been visible all along." Phelps's gaze flicked nervously toward the envelope. Miss Marple allowed a brief pause, then leaned slightly forward, knitting needles idly clicking in rhythm with her words. "It is remarkable, really, how patience and observation can be weaponized. Someone who has lived in these walls for years, who understands the habits and fears of every resident, can guide suspicion toward convenient targets, shaping events to their own advantage." The room was silent, except for the soft clicking of her needles. Phelps's breathing had quickened, his hands clenched slightly, then relaxed as he tried to regain composure. "Yet no strategy, no matter how cunning," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on him, "can withstand the scrutiny of someone who observes without preconception. The ledger, the Queen of Spades, the letter framing Reverend Holt, every act was part of a larger design. But it is precisely the consistency of that design, the repetition of subtle gestures and habits, that betrays the mind behind them." Mallory leaned forward, voice tight with anticipation. "Miss Marple, are you saying—" "Yes," she interrupted softly, "that the person responsible is here, in this very room." Phelps's eyes widened, and for a fraction of a second his carefully constructed calm shattered. Miss Marple allowed the pause to stretch, observing every nuance of his behaviour. The slight tremor of a hand, the quick glance toward the envelope, the micro-expression of fear and recognition all confirmed her suspicions. "You see, Phelps," she said, her voice unwavering, "your careful planning has failed not because of force or accusation or threats, but because the pattern could not be hidden. Every movement you made, every small act was part of a rhythm I have observed, and once the rhythm is understood, prediction becomes possible." He swallowed hard, then stepped back, his composure slipping further. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, voice tight. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, eyes calm, sharp and unwavering. "You know precisely what I mean. The Queen of Spades, the missing evidence, the attack on Mrs. Branson, all of it was orchestrated by you. Your motive is clear, a need to assert control, to reclaim power where once you were powerless, to manipulate perception and orchestrate fear. And you have done so with patience and cunning, yet it is your psychology, not your cleverness, that has betrayed you." Phelps's hands shook visibly now, and he made a sudden step toward the door. The instinctive move was both a test and a desperate bid for escape, but Miss Marple had anticipated it. She rose slowly, her movements measured and deliberate. "There is no need for haste, Phelps. No one wishes to harm you. It is only necessary to acknowledge the truth." He froze, as though realizing the inevitability of his position. The flicker of defiance in his eyes was quickly replaced by resignation. He sank into the nearest chair, his shoulders slumping. You've seen through it all," he muttered, almost in disbelief. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, though her gaze remained piercing. "Yes, the truth has been visible all along, hidden in plain sight in your habits, your gestures, your manipulations, and now that it is known, there is no longer any power in concealment." Mallory stepped forward to secure Phelps, but Miss Marple allowed the moment to linger. She had orchestrated the confrontation not through force, but through understanding, the quiet, patient observation that revealed the criminal without the need for coercion. Phelps's confession, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. He recounted, in halting words, how long-held frustrations and suppressed grievances had driven him to craft the scheme, how he had relied on Holt's ambition and the villagers' assumptions, and how he had believed himself invisible in plain sight. The narrative matched every subtle observation Miss Marple had made over the past weeks. As Phelps was led away by Mallory, the tension in the room slowly dissipated. Holt, Alice, and Mrs. Branson exhaled with relief. The rectory, which had seemed haunted by manipulation and fear, settled into quiet normalcy once more. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window, knitting needles clicking softly. She allowed herself a small private smile, knowing that patience, observation, and careful reasoning had resolved a case that had seemed tangled beyond comprehension. The criminal had been clever, his motives deeply personal, but the truth, meticulously uncovered, had prevailed, and in the stillness of the rectory as the afternoon sun slanted across the floorboards, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals often reveal themselves not through violence or confession, but through the patterns of their own making, and that the quietest observer, armed with patience and perception, could see those patterns clearly, bringing justice where it seemed impossible. The rectory had settled into a rare calm. Phelps was in custody, the bishop's death explained, and the villagers cautiously returning to their routines. Holt, vindicated, resumed his duties, and the servants breathed a collective sigh of relief. Even Inspector Mallory had relaxed, leaning back in his chair by the hearth, satisfied that the case had been resolved. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly in her usual corner, knitting needles, clicking in an almost hypnotic rhythm, her sharp eyes not missing a single detail of the room, the shadows or the expressions on those around her. It was then that a letter, delivered by the local postman, drew her attention. The envelope was thick and unmarked, save for a single faint symbol in the corner that looked almost like a clerical flourish. She broke the seal and unfolded the contents, a brief typed note that chilled her despite its brevity. "You may think the matter concluded, but Phelps was only a symptom, not the cause. Look closer. Some truths are hidden beneath the apparent resolution." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She folded the letter carefully, setting it on her lap. The timing was impeccable. The letter had arrived just as everyone assumed the case was closed. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Someone else had orchestrated the broader plan, manipulating events from a distance, using Phelps as a convenient tool while remaining unseen. Her mind raced, recalling every moment of the investigation. Holt's misdirection, the vanished evidence, the attack on Mrs. Branson, and Phelps's carefully measured steps. All of it might have been anticipated by a mind even more cunning than the verger's. She could feel the pattern she had uncovered moments ago shifting, revealing hidden layers she had not yet considered. She rose quietly and approached Mallory, who looked up with relief. "What is it, Miss Marple? Have you found something else?" She handed him the note, observing his brow furrow. "Read this carefully. It suggests that while Phelps acted, someone else may have been guiding him. This is not merely a final warning. It is a challenge." Mallory's hands trembled slightly as he reread the words. "You mean there's another player?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, someone who has remained in the shadows, anticipating our every move and allowing Phelps to act as a decoy. The subtle manipulations, the psychological traps, even the timing of the attack on Mrs. Branson. These all suggest orchestration beyond Phelps' capacity alone." Alice Harper, who had been seated nearby, looked alarmed. "But who could it be? Surely not anyone we've seen." "Perhaps not in plain sight," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze sweeping the room. "But the clues have always been here, hidden in gestures, comments, and small interactions that seemed innocent. One must only know how to look." She returned to the ledger, recalling the small smudge she had once noticed, the faint discoloration on a page where a notation seemed slightly off, and the subtle hesitation in Holt's answers to certain questions. What if the final layer of manipulation had come from someone whose role had been assumed benign? Someone everyone had trusted? The idea struck her fully when she remembered the vestry key, which had inexplicably disappeared the night before the bishop's death. It had been recovered, of course, but who else knew of its exact location and could have handled it without raising suspicion? Holt had access, certainly, but Miss Marple recalled his behaviour, and something about his eagerness to clear himself now seemed less convincing. Could the ambitious former chaplain have been the real architect, using Phelps to carry out the physical acts while orchestrating the perception of guilt? She considered the timing of events. Phelps's meticulous movements, the attack on Branson, the vanishing evidence, all aligned perfectly with Holt's schedule, his knowledge of parish routines, and his ambitions. Each misdirection, subtle hint, and carefully planted object might have been planted or timed by Holt himself, guiding Phelps's actions while remaining ostensibly uninvolved. The letter in her hands confirmed the possibility. The mastermind wanted the investigators to believe the puzzle was solved, to lull them into complacency before revealing the final truth. Miss Marple moved to the hearth, setting the letter down. "Inspector, we must reconsider Holt's involvement. We have long accepted his innocence because of surface evidence, his apparent reaction to events, and the obvious cunning of Phelps. But someone had to guide him, ensure the timing was precise, and select the right decoy to carry the suspicion. Look at every moment of hesitation, every forced explanation, and every eager offer to assist. It may now represent strategy rather than fear or relief." Mallory shook his head, incredulous. "You mean the case isn't over? After all that? Phelps, he was just a pawn?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said, "and we must approach carefully. Any overt accusation could push the true mastermind further into concealment, but the pattern is visible if one considers who had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the motivation to guide the verger so precisely. The criminal's genius lies not only in action, but in patience and subtle manipulation of perception." She turned her attention to Holt, who was nervously straightening papers on a side table. She noted a slight twitch in his hand, a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack that only the observant would notice. Miss Marple realized, with a quiet thrill of confirmation, that the final test was at hand. Holt had believed himself undetected, his careful orchestration successful. Yet here, in the calm of the rectory parlour, his micro-expressions betrayed the slightest fear of discovery. "I think it is time," she murmured to Mallory, "to observe the reactions, to introduce a subtle challenge, and to watch carefully. The real mastermind has assumed invisibility, but the truth can be revealed through the smallest of pressures, an unexpected detail, a suggestion, or even a reminder of the evidence they believe they have controlled. Miss Marple paused, allowing the tension to build, every participant in the room sensing the weight of her observation, though unaware of its focus. The final confrontation would not be a storm of accusation, but a gentle, precise provocation designed to expose the true architect behind the tragedies. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the rectory in a warm, deceptive calm, Miss Marple allowed herself a single, subtle smile. The game was far from over, yet the pieces were finally all in view. One careful observation, one perfectly timed prompt, and the true villain, hidden in plain sight all along, would reveal themselves. The final twist awaited, and she, with patience and insight, was ready. The rectory parlour held a tense, almost suffocating quiet. Miss Marple, calm as ever, observed every subtle shift in posture, every flicker of expression, every tiny hesitation in speech. Holt, seated near the hearth, looked more uneasy than he had all week, his hands twisting in his lap. The villagers and servants, summoned under the pretext of clarifying the aftermath of the case, now felt the weight of a lingering uncertainty. Phelps's arrest had seemed to close the matter, but the letter Miss Marple had received hinted that the resolution was far from final. She rose slowly, letting her knitting needles rest on the arm of her chair. Her gaze, sharp and deliberate, settled on Holt. "Reverend," she said softly, "we have believed for days that the culprit was apparent, that the pattern of events led only to one mind. Yet the truth is seldom so simple. Patterns can mislead, especially when guided by a mind capable of anticipating every move of those who watch." Holt's brow furrowed, a subtle tightening of his lips betraying a flicker of fear. "Miss Marple, I don't understand. He was the one, wasn't he?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "He was a tool, Reverend, a meticulous, patient instrument through which a more calculating mind could operate. But no one, not Phelps, not any of us, could anticipate the subtle manipulation behind the orchestration of events without observing the smallest details, the tiny cracks in composure, the gestures that seemed incidental but were, in truth, deliberate." Her eyes swept the room, returning briefly to Mrs. Branson and Alice Harper, ensuring both understood the gravity of the moment. Then, turning fully to Holt, she continued, "The ledger, the Queen of Spades, the vanished evidence, the attacks, they were all consistent with Phelps' methods. Yet only someone else could have planned the sequence with such foresight, predicted Phelps' predictable patterns, and chosen him precisely because of those patterns." Holt's hands tightened in his lap, a faint tremor revealing more than words could. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "The clues were in plain sight, Reverend, but overlooked because we were distracted by apparent innocence. Consider your eagerness to assist, your timing, your carefully measured responses. You believe that aligning yourself with the investigation's progress would shield you from suspicion, and yet, in your gestures, your habitual placements, and even your pauses, the truth was always traceable." Holt inhaled sharply. You think I orchestrated this? Not just the events themselves," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "but the manipulation of perception. Phelps carried out the acts, but your influence was the invisible hand, guiding him, testing the investigators, and controlling the narrative. Each misstep we attributed to luck, each coincidence we excused, was your doing." The room seemed to constrict with tension. Alice Harper's eyes widened. Mrs. Branson's hand flew to her mouth, and Mallory straightened, uncertain of how to proceed. Holt's face was pale, his usually measured voice faltering. I didn't mean... I just... Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained piercing. "Intent is not obscured by cleverness, Reverend. Your desire to control, to manipulate, and to assert authority, long suppressed, has guided every thread of this tragedy. The motive was never the obvious one. It was deeper, personal, and psychological. You wished to prove your intelligence, your foresight, and your subtle mastery over those around you. You underestimated the power of observation, patience, and pattern recognition. Holt's eyes darted toward the window, as if searching for a means of escape. Miss Marple noticed the quick intake of breath, the subtle shift of weight, and the faint, nervous twitch of a hand near the side table. She had anticipated this, the final test, the moment of true reaction, when the guilt that had been carefully concealed would manifest. Inspector Mallory stepped forward instinctively. "Reverend Holt, you need to come with me." Holt's sudden movement startled everyone. He bolted toward the door, a desperate bid to flee. But Miss Marple, anticipating exactly this reaction, remained calm. "You will find that running only confirms the truth, Reverend," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. She had instructed Mallory to place discreet observers near the exits, ensuring no escape without a direct confrontation. Holt froze, realizing the inevitability. The subtle patterns, the hidden observation, and Miss Marple's quiet omnipresence had cornered him. He sank back against the doorframe, breathing heavily, the colour draining from his face. I didn't think anyone would notice." "Notice, Reverend, yes." "The pattern was always visible," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but unwavering. "The tiny inconsistencies, the gestures, the alignment of opportunity and influence, they all pointed here, and once one sees the pattern, the truth is unmistakable." Mallory approached and gently took hold of Holt's arm, guiding him toward the waiting constables. "You'll have a chance to explain everything formally," he said, his tone firm but professional. As Holt was led away, the room exhaled collectively. Mrs. Branson sank into her chair, pale but relieved. Alice Harper allowed herself a small, shaky smile. Mallory, though exhausted, looked at Miss Marple with newfound respect, the depth of her insight clear in the stillness of the room. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window, picking up her knitting once more. She allowed herself a quiet reflection on the final revelation. The case had seemed resolved, Phelps had been apprehended, and the village had believed in closure. Yet beneath the surface, the real mastermind had orchestrated events with subtle brilliance, using knowledge of habits, psychology, and perception to manipulate those around him. Only patient observation, attention to patterns, and careful deduction had uncovered the hidden truth. She sipped her tea, serene, her eyes catching the late afternoon light slanting across the floorboards. "Crimes," she mused softly, "often leave their answers in the smallest of details, in gestures overlooked, and in patterns unnoticed. The cleverest criminal can act boldly, but even the most subtle manipulation leaves a trace, and those who observe patiently, without assumption, can see the invisible thread and follow it to the source." The rectory had returned to a tentative calm. Justice had been served at last, though the depth of the deception left a lingering unease, a reminder that appearances are never wholly trustworthy. Miss Marple's quiet vigilance had once again revealed what others could not see, proving that the smallest observation, the tiniest detail, and the sharpest insight were enough to unravel even the most carefully constructed web of deceit. Outside, the village resumed its rhythms, but inside the rectory the echoes of manipulation, cunning, and hidden motives lingered, a testament to the danger that cleverness could hide in plain sight. And Miss Marple, knitting quietly by the window, remained the ever-watchful observer, patient, perceptive, and one step ahead of all. The village had settled into a deceptive calm. The rectory, once echoing with tension, manipulation, and fear, now hummed with a semblance of ordinary life. The windows reflected the late afternoon sun, and the air was tinged with the soft scent of lavender from the gardens outside. Phelps was securely in custody. Holt had resumed his responsibilities with cautious optimism, and the villagers, sensing closure, had begun to return to their routines. Yet, for Miss Marple, the resolution was never as simple as appearances suggested. She stood in the doorway of the rectory, glancing back once more at the quiet interior. The evidence had been collected, the final confession secured, and the true mastermind revealed, but a small, nagging thought lingered at the edge of her mind. Patterns, once perceived, revealed not only solutions, but the subtle gaps, the almost imperceptible irregularities that could signal something deeper. She had traced the threads, observed every gesture, anticipated every reaction, Yet one minor detail refused to settle neatly. It was the vestry ledger resting in its usual place on the side table. She had carefully reviewed it multiple times, noting the smudges, the deliberate angling, the notations placed with what seemed a casual hand. And yet, there was one line, almost invisible, that did not match the rhythm of Phelps's habits or Holt's known behaviour. A faint initial, barely legible, set apart from the others, a mark that seemed entirely incidental, but to Miss Marple, no mark was ever entirely meaningless. She made a mental note of it, a whisper of unease that refused to be ignored. Outside, the village square bustled quietly. Children ran through the narrow lanes, and the church bell tolled the hour with a comforting regularity. Yet Miss Marple's eyes, so accustomed to observing the unnoticed, caught the subtle movement of the postman pausing by the corner shop, glancing toward the rectory with a hesitation that was almost imperceptible. He carried another letter, folded neatly, sealed with an emblem she did not immediately recognize. It was a minor event, trivial to any casual observer, but to her it suggested that the story might not be entirely concluded. Someone, somewhere, was waiting, watching, or preparing the next act in a series of manipulations. As she walked along the path toward the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of mysteries. Each crime, each act of deceit, left its traces in the patterns of behaviour, the quirks of human psychology, and the subtleties of the environment. Yet every answer seemed to bring a new question, a shadow where none had been perceived, a pause in speech, a seemingly irrelevant mark that hinted at deeper motives. The resolution of one case did not guarantee finality. It merely opened the mind to the next observation, the next insight, the next challenge to be unravelled. She paused near the corner of the green where a faint breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. Her gaze fell on a child chasing a loose ribbon through the air, laughing without concern for the complexities of adult life. For the villagers, life had resumed, neat and orderly, the chaos seemingly behind them. Yet Miss Marple's mind traced the invisible threads beneath this surface, the careful orchestration of events, the unseen influences that guided human action, the motives hidden behind polite words and habitual gestures. The pattern of human behaviour was never simple, never fully knowable. There were always loose ends, subtle hints, small contradictions that refused to resolve entirely. Her thoughts drifted back to the letter she had just noticed the postman carrying. A minor detail, easily dismissed, yet potentially significant. It could be a trivial correspondence, or it could be the first whisper of another intricate plot, one that relied on misdirection, observation, and the careful manipulation of perception. The mind capable of orchestrating the events she had just unravelled could easily attempt another, and in that possibility the game would begin anew. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. She had solved the mysteries at hand, revealed the hidden motives, and untangled the web of deceit. But she understood, better than anyone, that the world was never fully knowable. Minor details might slip through, secrets could remain buried, and clever minds might yet find ways to manipulate events from behind the scenes. That was the nature of her work, to observe, to discern, to anticipate, and to see the invisible threads connecting actions to intentions. As she walked slowly toward the edge of the village, the bell tower behind her casting long shadows across the cobblestones, she allowed herself a final reflection. The case of Bishop Carroway, Phelps and Holt had ended, the truth had been revealed, and justice, in its measured way, had been served. Yet the lingering questions, the faint initials, the hesitation of the postman, the subtle misalignments in the ledger, reminded her that mysteries never truly ended. Each resolution was but a pause, a breath before the next complexity emerged, testing perception, patience, and insight. She reached the village outskirts, the horizon stretching before her, golden in the late afternoon sun. The air carried both the satisfaction of closure and the whisper of uncertainty. Somewhere, perhaps, another intrigue was unfolding, waiting for someone to notice the faintest irregularity, the smallest clue, the subtle deviation from expectation. Miss Marple's heart and mind, ever attuned to such nuances, were ready. With a serene yet vigilant composure, she continued her walk, blending into the quiet rhythms of the village, aware that the world held countless patterns yet unseen, motives yet unrevealed, and truths hidden behind ordinary gestures. The mysteries would come, as they always did, but she, with her patience, perception, and quiet genius, would be ready to see what others could not. The village seemed calm, almost ordinary, yet the smallest of details, the faintest anomalies, and the quietest gestures suggested otherwise. Somewhere in the shadows a new story was beginning, and Miss Marple, as ever, would be there to follow its threads, step by careful step, into revelation. And with that, she disappeared down the lane, knitting in hand, her mind alert, her senses attuned, leaving behind a village that believed its peace restored, unaware that the next mystery was already stirring in the wings,